Welcome, everybody. I wanted to thank you very much for joining us tonight. This is a huge passion of ours at the Conservancy, our work on sea level rise and identifying impacts to this community. So I'm really happy that you're able to be with us tonight. It's going to be a great presentation. Better for some who are farther away from the water than those who are right on the water, but anyway, I think you'll find it very interesting. A few years back, the Conservancy set out to inform ourselves and to inform the community about the expected impacts of climate change on our historic Watch Hill community, especially the impacts along Bay Street. For the past 3 years, the Conservancy has led a community-wide initiative to understand the impacts of sea level rise and storms in Watch Hill. We've had a wonderful engagement by many local organizations in this effort. Our goal was to move away from a place of discussing someday impacts will be here to getting to a place where we could specifically define where in the community was susceptible to impact and when those impacts were expected to happen. The purpose behind our efforts was really simple. It was to be prepared for such a change to the extent that we can. To understand what we as a community or what we as individual property owners can do to prepare for these impacts. And to work with some urgency to understand all of this while we still have time to prepare and to adapt. The work has already had a positive impact. Many of you have read about this. It provided much of the evidence behind the fire district's successful grant application. The community was granted $250,000 to create improvements at the entrance to the Napa Tree Conservation Area and in the paved parking lot between the Merchant Square shops and the entrance to the yacht club. You know how that floods all the time with the nuisance tides. So the fire district has a terrific grant opportunity and some very specific construction projects to get done to mitigate those impacts. And this information was used to get that grant. Tonight, Dr. August will brief you on our process and update you on what we've learned about mitigation options from nuisance tides and from 3 to 5 feet of sea level rise. And Dr. Oakley will go over the impacts that large storms have had on Napa Tree and Watch Hill. I want to take a moment to thank our speakers for their presentations and to thank the team who organized this evening's event. Specifically, Jocelyn Leahy, our Executive Director, Janice Sassy, our Napa Tree Manager and do everything gal, Lori Andrews, our Administrative Assistant, Tom Papadilla, who does everything that nobody else is getting done, and of course, Chef Extraordinaire, Grant Simmons. So please. And for tonight's presentation, I also really want to take a moment to thank all those organizations in the community that helped us do this work over the last 3 years. It's been a real commitment. We meet usually monthly throughout the winter months, and there's been a lot to do, and the collaboration has been extremely productive. So thank you to all the organizations who helped us. There'll be a list of everybody specifically in Dr. August's presentation, but I'd like to raise a hand for those people. And now I'd like to ask Jocelyn Leahy to introduce our presenters. Jocelyn also, since Pete August is usually our moderator, and he's one of our presenters, he cannot moderate for himself. So Jocelyn will be the moderator this evening for question and answer. That will happen at the end of both presentations.
Thanks, Deborah. Good evening, everyone. As Deborah said, I'm Jocelyn Leahy, the Executive Director of the Watch Hill Conservancy. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. August and Dr. Oakley. I'm thrilled that they are here to present to you this evening. We're very lucky to have them. First to speak is Dr. Peter August, who has served on the faculty of the URI Department of Natural Resources Science for almost 40 years, and he is now a professor emeritus in that program. His areas of expertise are GIS mapping, landscape ecology, and conservation land stewardship. He was the founding president of the Rhode Island Natural History Survey, the first director of the URI Coastal Institute, and has served as a board member or trustee for the South Kingstown Land Trust, the Richmond Land Trust, and the Nature Conservancy. He is currently the treasurer for the National Parks Service Wood-Pawcatuck National Wild and Scenic River Systems, which gained its designation just recently. It's a very, very important thing for our community to have that happen. And he has served as the chair of the Napatri Science Advisors since 2010, and he's also a current vice president of the Watch Hill Conservancy. Dr. Bryan Oakley, who will be our second presentation this evening, is associate professor at the Coastal Geology at Eastern Connecticut State University. He is the assistant chairman of the Department of Environmental Earth Science, and Dr. Oakley is the region's expert on coastal geology. He provides technical counsel to the Rhode Island Coastal Resources Management Council on a variety of coastal geological issues, such as sea level rise, coastal erosion, and offshore wind turbine siting. Dr. Oakley is also a Napatri Point geology science advisor and sits on the board of the directors for the Rhode Island Natural History Survey. Dr. Oakley and his students have done a number of important studies on Napatri Point, some of which you'll learn about this evening. And Dr. Oakley actually provided us our first introduction to the science of sea level rise 3 years ago when we started the Planning for a Resilient Future initiative. So both Dr. August and Dr. Oakley donate an incredible amount of their time and energy to the Conservancy, to Napatri Point programs, and to our Planning for a Resilient Future initiative. I can't thank them enough for the wealth of data that they collect, they process, and they share with all of us. They are really the reason why we can be here tonight and share this presentation with you. So let's get to it. I'd like to ask you to offer a warm welcome to Dr. Peter August, who will be our first presenter this evening.
Jocelyn, thank you. Deborah, thank you. One more thank you that we need to make, and that's to all of you for joining us this evening. As you're going to see very soon, there are a lot of people behind the remarks that I'm going to make tonight. This has been a 3-year effort, a ton of different folks participating in it, and I'm the lucky one. I get to summarize 3 years worth of work for all of you. I'm going to talk about where our focus is, what exactly the goals of the project are, and the whole overall purpose of our study. And actually, Deborah did a fantastic job going over these points. We're really focused on Napatri and Bay Street. All of Watch Hill is not really in our sights right now. We're really paying close attention to Napatri, the Napatri access route, the Merchants Lot, the stores in Larkin Square, and Bay Street proper. And you'll see that coming up. As Deborah explained, this has been a 3-year ongoing project. The Conservancy has done all the back office work, coordinating everything, but it's really been a fantastic team effort. Over the 3 years, we started off in year 1 trying to get our arms around the science of sea level rise, nuisance, tides, and storms. And Bryan gave us a fantastic lecture at the very beginning on the nature of these phenomena that are happening. Teresa Green from the Sea Grant Program and Janet Friedman from the CRMC kind of rounded out that triad of lectures, all of which are on the Watch Hill Conservancy's Resilient webpage. These are definitely worth a watch. You'll learn something, I promise. And subsequent meetings were all about, okay, we understand the science. Where are we vulnerable in our community? What's going to have issues with 1 foot, 2 foot, 5 feet, 10 feet of either sea level rise or surge? We spent a lot of time studying what other coastal communities are doing to try to mitigate these changes. And this last year, we took a very deep dive into your favorite topic, the seawall. The one thing that sits between Watch Hill Harbor and everything else. And we'll summarize those results. So it's been a very busy 3 years. And if you only remember one thing tonight, remember that this isn't the work of one person or one organization. This has been fully embraced by a variety of stakeholders here in Watch Hill. And the ultimate manifestation of their commitment to understanding this issue is a resolution that the group offered after their first year, declaring this is an issue that we can't kick the can down the road. We have to understand what's happening. We have to be thoughtful about our mitigation plans. And it was signed off by all the participants. So this is truly a multi-organizational initiative. And again, I'm the lucky one who gets to share with you what we found. Bryan and I are going to tag team some of the big issues. I'm going to talk about nuisance tide, sea level rise, especially the 3 to 5 foot scenario. Bryan's going to talk about major storms and what an appropriate topic these days, huh? After we've had a couple of hurricane passes through the neighborhood, and guess what? We have plenty of hurricane season left. And so big storms are definitely part of the portfolio, and this is something Bryan has been studying for a while. Let's talk about nuisance tides. If you're a local, you know nuisance tides. They don't come once in a while, they're coming all the time. We were out Friday doing some Napa tree science work. I couldn't believe how high the tide was and how narrow the entrance to Napa tree was. On your right, that top right, this is a situation where a very normal high tide makes it impossible to get on Napa tree and stay dry. And I'm going to give you some numbers on this stuff in a minute. But that level of high tide happens 39 days a year. And look at the sea state. This isn't like a big storm. This is like sheet glass, and it happens all the time. The photograph below it, down by the yacht club and the Napa Tree Access Road, 63 days a year. So these are really, really common events. And they're getting more common. The graph that you see on the right with the blue bars is a long-term record of nuisance tides as measured by the Newport tide gauge. And the only thing that you need to look at is that green line. That is the linear regression line going through those nuisance tide levels, number of days per year, since 1938. And guess what? The line's going up. There have been a bunch of studies on this, and however these nuisance tides are, they're going to become more so as we go forward. One thing that we have been doing a lot is trying to connect up impacts with actual tide levels. And this graph on the left is basically telling us at what level of high tide can we not get an ATV on Napa Tree for public safety reasons or to support our science and monitoring and education programs? And at what level can we not walk onto Napa Tree without wading through the water? And so around 1/2 foot high tide, and I'll explain my tidal datum in a minute. At about 0.5 feet, we can't get the ATV on. At 1 foot, we can't walk on. Now, the thing about tidal elevations is you need a reference point, and there are a bunch of reference points out there. And if you read nautical charts, the reference point is going to be mean low water. every tidal condition I'm giving you is reference to mean, higher, high water. That is the tidal elevation at the highest high tide each day, every day, for an 18-year period. And so when I say 0 mean higher high water, that is a totally average high water line. When we get a half a foot above that or a foot above that, we see some serious flooding. And I can show you, and I will show you some pictures of what a 1.25 feet and a 1.5 feet look like. So how do we solve the Napa tree problem? We have a short-term fix. And the short-term fix is to basically elevate the entrance path out to Napa tree with the beach club parking lot on one side, with the harbor on the right side. The thing that's made this a lot trickier than we ever understood was when you're standing at the entrance gate to Napa tree and you look forward and to your right, you see nothing until you see the Barn Island Refuge near Stonington. All that open water creates a lot of wave action when the winds come from the north. And so even though it might look calm on most days, the entrance to Napa tree can have some very high wave energy. And so all of our engineers have said, look, if you want to keep that Napa tree entrance safe from moderate or severe wind events, you need a low stone revetment there to keep all the sand in place. And so in this plan, which is the work of a very accomplished local marine engineer, we would actually, the work of a couple of different engineering firms, we would have a stone revetment on the harbor side to protect the entrance, a base of stone, a foot or 1.5 feet of sand on top of the stone, basically increasing the elevation 3 to 3.5 feet to what it is now. That would buy us about 15 years. That'll absorb a 1 foot sea level rise, probably without a problem. Yes, we can get some big storms come in and wash some of that sand away, and we probably have to replenish it, but that'll solve the problem for about 15 years. So as you're gonna see, as the talk progresses, we have urgent short-term problems we can't wait to fix. They need to be fixed now. We have middle-term problems where we have the comfort of a little bit of time to think about this, like the 3 and 5 foot scenarios. And then Bryan's going to talk to you about big problems, which I'll let Bryan figure out the big severe storms. So that's our plan for the Napa tree entrance. And I'm going to circle back, as Deborah mentioned, to explain how we hope to pay for all this. Here's another issue that we have, and I know that all of you have seen this. This is the yacht club making the turn, going out to Napa tree, out by the cabanas. This is what. Let's see, what's the tide here? I'm at a really odd angle here. 1.34 feet mean higher high water. So this is 1.25 feet higher than your typical high tide. That's pretty darn flooded. And that level of flooding last year happened 10 days. We are so lucky. Now, I mean, I feel we're so lucky. I don't know if you share my enthusiasm, but we have a USGS tide gauge at the Dockmasters booth there in Watch Hill Harbor that records a tidal elevation every 15 minutes, 24/7. And about an hour after that tidal elevation is posted, you can download it. And so we have an incredible record of when I see flooding like that and I take a picture, I look at the timestamp on the picture, go to the USGS gauge, see exactly what that tide is, and then I can figure out, oh, this happens 10 times a year, 20 times a year. So we're really, really fortunate to have really good data to back up some of these flooding conditions that we all experience. And so with information like that, can you see on the left, the water just kind of dribbling down the ramp to the yacht club? 0.8 feet mean high water. And then it gets worse from there, okay? So when the tide hits 0.8 feet above mean high water, we breach that low point in the seawall, water starts coming across, and that's when the problems started. This is 1.25 feet mean high water. Looking at the yacht club, cabanas are to the right. That happened 16 days last year. So, you know, these aren't rare events. These are happening pretty frequently. What's the solution to this part of the Napattree access road? To raise that low spot where the ramp is at the yacht club. That's kind of a no-brainer. It's a lot more complex than that because the ramp has to meet ADA compliance issues. We also need to build up the road that you drive across a couple of inches. We have to maintain the slope down to the seawall, and we have to really seal that road because the source of the water there at the Napattree entrance is gurgling over the ramp at 0.8 feet is when it starts, but also gurgling up where the roadbed and the seawall meet and gurgling up from the roadbed itself. Next time you walk along there, look at how cracked and fractured that is. And as the groundwater elevation pushes up, a lot of the flooding is just coming through the road. So we need to raise the road, seal the road, slope it down to the seawall. And that's how we can mitigate this part of the neighborhood. As Deborah explained, we have a grant from DEM, 200. I think the final number is 250 even. They cut us 9,000 at the last minute, but the total budget is a blend of grant money from the Rhode Island DEM on community resilience. How can this State Department of Environmental Management make communities like Watch Hill more resilient to sea level rise? And the fire district, who is the author of the grant, has generously come up with some cash match, which there's some pretty significant match requirements with this grant fund. We are awaiting a final signed contract from DEM. Once we get that, we're ready to hit the ground running. Step one, we have some big permitting that we have to do. There's a lot of layers to the permitting process, and that'll probably take us 6 months to a year before we can do anything. And so we're anxious to get those permit applications in place. And of course, we'll be very mindful to do the road work at the Napattree entrance and the work at the Napattree entrance, certainly in the off season, because it's, you know, it's one thing worse than having to wait on Napattree is not being able to get on Napattree because there's bulldozers in the way. So we're very mindful of the timing on this. So there's another vulnerability in this whole nuisance tide issue that we need to talk about. And that's that section of seawall from the Napattree entrance to about, I'm gonna say, half to maybe less than 2/3 of the way to the yacht club. And there's a sign right there at the seawall where it's pretty high, it drops off, and it's about a foot lower going out to Napattree. We have cleverly called that segment of the seawall the low wall. And the low wall is a very vulnerable spot for us. That is overtopped 10 times a year. And that needs to be fixed pretty darn quick. You'll see the elevation of the top of the low wall is only 1.5 feet. The rest of the seawall is about 2.5 feet. I will go over that in a minute. But the low wall needs to be raised. It needs to be repaired, and that needs to happen pretty fast because 10 times a year, the tides will overtop it. Basically, anything over 1.5 feet mean high water. and the low wall is no longer serving its purpose. So that's in the urgent, we need to get on it right now. And we haven't cracked the nut on how to pay for that one yet, but we're working on it. It's not going to be cheap, but that's on our radar screen right now. So nuisance tides are an issue that I've hopefully introduced you to. We know the nature of the nuisance tides, the areas along Watch Hill Harbor and Napatri where we're quite vulnerable, and we have a good handle on at least our short-term fixes. The next thing I want to talk about is sea level rise, okay? And our group has sort of targeted the 3-foot and the 5-foot sea level rise scenarios as the focus of their planning action. 3 feet is going to be here around 2050, 5 feet is going to be 2070, 9 to 10 feet, 2100, just to put all this in context. And so we're focusing on the 3 and 5 foot scenarios. Besides having an awesome USGS tide gauge in Watch Hill Harbor, the state of Rhode Island, I don't think it has a peer in the country that has as good a data as inundation maps for every conceivable sea level rise nuisance tide scenario you can think about for our whole coast in Narragansett Bay. And that's the map on the right. That's our 3-foot sea level rise scenario. And these maps that you see that look like this are coming from something called Storm Tools, which was developed by the Rhode Island CRMC. It's now part of the permitting planning process. You need to look at their maps to really understand your vulnerability. And you or I, mapping people, were very involved in pulling this off too. The first thing that we did was to evaluate, okay, we have all these maps of vulnerability for the community. Are they any good? Are they any, or how accurate are they? Well, I can tell you how accurate the underlying data are. The critical data set for these inundation maps is elevation. Using a technology called LiDAR, where an airplane flies over, shoots a laser beam to the ground, measures the amount of time that pulse gets back to the airplane. We have an elevation value every 3 feet accurate to this level, okay? And when we're looking at bare sand or parking lot, areas that aren't disturbed by tree canopies or tall skyscrapers or something like that, we're looking at this kind of accuracy. And we've independently measured. And so we had this fantastic, well, we had this interesting event, but it was fantastic to test the data a couple of years ago where we had a nor'easter come in with a 2-foot storm surge. And we were able to measure that off the Watch Hill USGS gauge. That surge brought in 2 feet above mean high water. We pulled up the 2-foot map in Storm Tools and looked at the locations of the wet line at peak surge relative to where the map said they should be. When I saw this, my jaw dropped. I mean, the lines were probably within a foot or two of where they should be. So the moral of this story is, if you spend any time looking at Storm Tools inundation maps, believe them. They are really, really accurate. And so having this level of confidence now, we can bring up maps of our community that will be at risk in a 3-foot scenario. And you can see in this part of Bay Street is the blue areas. Let's remind ourselves of what these blue areas are. 2050, high tide, twice a day. This isn't storms, high tide, twice a day. And so if you're going to drive down Bay Street, you better have your tide chart on your dashboard because you're not gonna be doing it at high tide twice a day. Down by Larkin Square in the yacht club, we have issues. And certainly the Navitri Access Road out to the beach club, the cabanas, we have issues high tide twice a day. 5-foot scenario, I'm not even gonna belabor this. Pick a panel, any panel, and you can see 5 feet of sea level rise is gonna seriously impact our community. Okay, so what can we do about it? So we're done freaking out and looking at the inundation models. What can we do about it? And we are deep into trying to get our arms around our gray solutions, and the most obvious gray solution is build up the seawall, and also more greener solutions that we can look at that will help mitigate these 3 and 5 foot scenarios. And so let's look at a cross section of our seawall. If you go from the yacht club to right over here, the average elevation at the top of the seawall is 2.4 feet above mean high water. Look at the elevation of the blue bar. That's the ocean on a typical high tide. So we have you know, a couple of feet buffer between the ocean and the top of the seawall right now. The elevation of the roadbed behind the seawall, 1.2 feet, okay? When we add 3 feet of water to the harbor, our 3 foot sea level rise, the ocean will overtop the seawall by 0.6 feet twice a day. So the seawall will be ineffective in the highest of high tides. Now, from the yacht club to just over here, that rarely gets overtopped. That little 2.4 feet of buffer between the ocean and the top of the seawall, that's a pretty good buffer. Have any of you ever seen that outside of a major storm? See water gurgling over that at like a supermoon tide? So I take that to mean if we want a comfortable buffer distance, 2.4 feet's working for us now. So what can we do to the seawall to make this work? The picture on the left is what I just showed you, 3 feet of sea level rise. We can elevate the seawall an additional 3 feet, take it up to 5.4 feet. That's our 3 foot ocean level. We still have our 2.4 foot buffer, but now we have a seawall that's quite a bit higher. And remember, this is only the 3 foot scenario. We're gonna also have to raise the roadbed to 4.2 feet. We can't keep the roadbed where it is because if the ocean level is here and the roadbed's here, water is going to seep in under. And so engineering the roadbed is every much as part of the solution as engineering the seawall. We're trying to understand sort of the green solutions to all of this too. It's a work in progress. We're trying to understand the economics of this. What's it going to cost to mitigate the problem? What's it going to cost the community if we don't do anything? And so these are big questions that we're staring at right now. So that's 3 years worth of meetings and learning and deliberation and debating and study that our group has done. And now let me pass the baton to my great friend and colleague, Bryan Oakley, who's going to talk about what do the big storms mean to us. Bryan, take it away.
All right, thank you.
And hold on, let me get you synced up here.
I'll just do that as a thank you for that. Thank you for the introduction, Jocelyn. Really, that's a fancy way of saying I'm a wharf rat kid who needed to find a job somewhere around the water, as my wife likes to say, I go play at the beach for work. Kind of what we did this morning. Played at the beach for a while. Janice, where were we? There. So what I'm going to talk tonight about is some ongoing and recently completed work we did, really going back the last 5 years. Prior to 2016, we were really working pretty hard on something called the Shoreline Change Special Area Management Plan, which was a collaboration between Rhode Island CRMC and a number of other university partners, mostly URI, as well as local groups. And one of our main tasks was to re-up the shoreline change maps. They hadn't been updated for the state since 2003. And so that set off some of this work, put some flags in the back of my head for things to go look at later. And then COVID happened. I couldn't do as much field work as usual. So some of this work actually came out of being home a lot, trying to homeschool and do everything else with my kids. The other part is ongoing and recent work dealing with the impacts after Sandy. Most of the monitoring I do down here field-wise started after Sandy in July of 2013, but we have other data sets we can look back at and really look at how Navitree's recovered since Sandy and what that means maybe going forward. So we call the talk a storm-driven ecosystem. That's a nod to people. It says that phrase all the time. Pete started with storms, and storms drive the changes we see down here in Navitree to a large extent. When I talk about that, I'm not talking about the flooding of Watch Hill. That's obviously something driven by sea level rise. But when we talk about changes to shorelines, mostly we're talking sediment moving around, shoreline retreating back. Think of it like erosion, but when the shoreline is just moving backwards, but it's maintaining a shoreline, we tend to say it's migrating rather than it's eroding. Eroding is it's narrowing in front of a seawall and going away, right? Migrating is it's just moving backwards. And storms drive that process. Whatever sea level rise does will accelerate that in the future, but it's a question of scale. Sea level rise since 1938 has been that. As Pete said, it's caused a whole host of problems already with that much change. Storm surge in the 1938 hurricane was 9.5 feet above mean high water. That's noise, that's signal. This is what Navitree looked like prior to the hurricane of 1938. There's two photographs there. One is an oblique view on the upper left of Navitree and Sandy Point. You can see when parts of Fort Mansfield still out there. The lower one is the only vertical aerial photograph of Navitree prior to the 38 hurricane. It was actually flown by the state of Connecticut. They turned the plane around Watch Hill, and as they did, they clipped a couple extra pictures, and it sits in their archive there. So we don't have a complete record on the length of Navitree. We have that at that eastern end in Watch Hill Park. That's what it looked like 3 days after the 1938 hurricane. I always remind people, I think one of the first things we were talking about storms with Janice very early on, going back a number of years now, that when this happens again, when, not if, it's going to look like the dark side of the moon to you down there. Your landmarks are going to be all messed up. Hopefully my profile markers stay. That's where we start some of our measurements from. But other than that, it's going to look like the dark side of the moon. And that's what it looked like. All the houses were gone. We all know the story about that. And Navitree changed after that storm. It wasn't just the 38 hurricane. That's what it looked like after Hurricane Carol. A view of the east end. You can see where the two groins, something called jetties, but jetties have inlets, so those are groins, on the north and south side that were put in, near as I can tell, between 1948 and 1951. That was also Hurricane Carol. The shops there may look familiar to you because the building is still there. If John Boothroyd, who was a geologist, but also a car guy, he could have told me what car that was, and he has, but I'm not a car guy, so I forgot. When I look at those photographs, I also look at other areas. That's a recent picture following Ida on Grand Isle, Louisiana. How does that look compared to what we saw in Navitree? Well, that's not a great example. Geologically, those are very small barriers, very muddy. We're on the edge of the Mississippi River Delta. Geologically, it doesn't really look like Navitree at all. But that one on the upper left is Dauphin Island, Alabama. It's a similar sized barrier to what we have here in Rhode Island, similar tidal range, similar width, similar height, similar forenoon height, pretty similar. That's what it looked like after Hurricane Katrina. Navitree is in the lower right. Geologically, that's actually a pretty similar response. Now, Dauphin had a little more storm surge than we did. Parts of the Gulf Coast had 25 feet of surge in Katrina. And so you see a few more surge channels and a few other features, but the end result is about the same. So one of the things that was nagging at me since we did that shoreline change mapping was how much does the shoreline change during the 1930 hurricane? Because we didn't have oblique or vertical aerial images of the whole of Napatri or the whole of the South Shore. We couldn't really look at that as part of that study. And we weren't using older data in that because we had a very standardized approach to the shoreline change map. They become regulatory documents once they're adopted by CRMC. You go to build a new coastal feature, a new coastal structure, you have to build 30 times the annual erosion rate from the coastal feature, crest of the dune or the crest of the bluff. So we took a very conservative approach when we do that. But we went back a little further, or I did, again, largely started during a sabbatical before COVID and then COVID, and looked at the shoreline change data, including a survey from 1883 done by NOAA, and looked at the changes between 1883 to now. And that allows us to look at the 38 hurricane in context and then the other storms after that. This is what these shoreline change maps look like. If you've never seen them, they exist for the entire state of Rhode Island. We didn't update all of them to 2014, which this one is, which was published in 2016. Some of the ones up the bay, we did a survey and found they hadn't changed enough to worry about, but the rest of the state was updated. I think it was 95 of these maps. They are around 45 inches long and 60 inches long on some of them. It's a ton of work, largely done by people in the lab, not by me. I just kind of puppet string. They do the work. And what we do on these is we actually draw the position of what we call the last high tide swash, at the wet dry line left from the last high tide. So high tide today was 1:30 or so in the afternoon. If you go out to the beach right now, you can see where that line is. Sometimes it's got wrack or seaweed in it. Sometimes it's just a wet line. But that wet and dark or dry and light sand shows up well in most aerial images. So we can draw those shorelines out on those photographs and compare how it's changed over time. We then calculate the total change, and we also measure an annualized rate. We basically divide the amount of change by the number of years. But this one, I went back further because we hadn't gone back before 1939. And this is an 1883 hydrographic survey of Fisher's Island and Little Narragansett Bay. I was zoomed in around Napatri and Sandy Point. Very dense work. You've got to remember, this is a crew of 4 guys in a small dory, basically surveying with lead line and sextant and taking positions off of features on the shoreline. They are incredibly accurate given the technology. People put the uncertainty on these maps as plus or minus 10 meters. My experience is probably even less than that. That means they were within 30 feet on all this. It's remarkable the level they can do. So we've done a few different things with this map. I had a student who digitized all of those soundings. Again, I just public string, they do all the work. But they clicked on every one of those and put a value in. So we have that as a data set, and a student did a different project on that. But out of this survey came a shoreline, and NOAA calls these T-sheets. And that means that they drew a shoreline on the map that they considered mean high water in this case, 1883. So by using that data, we were then able to start to look at Napatri over time before the 38 hurricane. And the way we do this is killing me not to wander. I'm a wanderer when I lecture, but I'll just stand here and gesture wildly. It allows us to draw that line. And in this case, the black line is 1883, and it's running along Napatri. So the image above is lined up with the graph below. That's where the shoreline is in 1883. Now, the lower it is on the graph, the further offshore it is. It's set up so it can maintain polarity with the figure above. As the line moves to the up on the graph, it's really moving north as well. And that's when we bring in 1934. We just have that little piece from the east end. Not much change, certainly not outside of any of the error bars we could put on those images. And then we get to 1939. So that's following the 1938 hurricane. And 7 months after, the beach is largely recovered. The dune system is definitely not. And you see some change. In some places, up to 60 feet of retreat of the shoreline, but in other places, not all that much. And when we take an average of the barrier of Napatri, the barrier extends from the point itself where the fort is to the harbor, essentially. It is about plus or minus 11 meters. Given the uncertainty of the old photographs and the old survey, statistically, it's hard to even say that changed, although we can tell qualitatively it certainly did. So what it always bugs me, though, is when you look at that, the shoreline really jumps back when you look at 1948, 1951, 1963. I'm doing this from memory right now. Okay. I can't see that little box. I have my glasses. And then from there, you don't see a lot of change after 1975. In fact, the shoreline kind of hangs around this one general area from the 70s on. So the question became why? And so if the 38 hurricane didn't cause that much retreat of the shoreline, that much migration of Napatri as a whole, even though it completely overwashed it, took all the houses off, it didn't cause full-scale retreat of the shoreline. When we see that original mapping that we did a couple of slides ago, Napatri's moved almost one whole width since 1939. Right? So most of the part of the center Napatri, walk out by the first offspring hole, not the original one, middle of the barrier. Where you're standing at the high tide line was essentially the back of Napatri in 1939. After the 38 hurricane. Before the 38 hurricane, it would be even a little further out. So the question is, why all this change if the 38 hurricane was the big storm? And what our working hypothesis is, and if I'm going to switch to this graph for a second, which is a little more complicated, but that's just an average of the last set of shorelines. I just took all of those distances and just took an average for each year. Is the 38 hurricane really set all of this off? Because the 38 hurricane leveled out, took the dunes away, obviously took the houses, casualties, and a lot of other negative impacts. And then we had a series of other storms. We had a hurricane in 1944. That was a bigger deal the further west you went from here. In fact, east of here, I don't think there was even that much impact when you get over to Narragansett or even further east. Then you had a couple of winter storms in 1950. You had Hurricane Carol in 1954, something called the Ash Wednesday storm in 1962, and then a series of extratropical storms or nor'easters until the early 1970s. And so what you see the graph do is, the graph goes relatively flat between 1883 and 1939, and then it shoots up. That's the rapid change that we saw. And it happened mostly because these smaller storms, and Hurricane Carol was a strong too. Dave Valley talked about Hurricane Carol, a significant storm, but it wasn't 38. It was able, all of those storms were able to overwash Napatri, and they might not have if they had had time between the 38 hurricane and the next storm. Come back. Let's talk about Sandy and what Sandy can teach us about that recovery. These are a couple of pictures Janice took after Sandy. You see overwash on the left-hand side. Overwash is sediment moving across the barrier from the beach, over the dunes to the back of the barrier. The picture on the right is erosion, or what we call frontal erosion of the dunes, where the dune has sparked or eroded on the front. What we did since Sandy, oh, thank you. I'll try not to smash the TV if I get enthusiastic. Looking at post-Sandy, we've done a few different things. We do field work. I do a series of measurements 4 times a year, plus storms, and averages about 6 times a year, where we measure what we call profiles, and I'll show you a couple of those in a second. We also use something called LiDAR. Pete introduced LiDAR earlier. It's an airplane, usually flies overhead shooting lasers, not like visible lasers, but lasers to the ground surface, bounces off and sends a signal back. It's like sonar but with lasers. And that gives us a really detailed elevation model of what Napatri looked like in different years. Now, we can't go collect those on demand, but we've got 2011, 2012, which is about 2 or 3 weeks after Sandy, 2014 and 2018. We can then compare those different years to look at Napatri as a whole in those 4 time slices. From that data, we can do a number of different things. We can extract things like the volume at that spot on Napatry. We basically slice through the data and say, okay, at this one site, how much sand is there? How much sand is in the dunes? How tall is the dune? And where is the dune? We can use that by looking at the crest, the peak of the dune. And so we can map all that out. And as Pete explained, LiDAR is extremely accurate. You know, plus or minus about that on your position and about that on your elevation in most cases. So we can measure these changes with a pretty good degree of confidence. That's what an elevation model looks like of Napatry. This is 2018 Army Corps of Engineers LiDAR data. So it actually has offshore bathymetry in it as well. The LiDAR technology has improved and they can actually send pulses out that penetrate the sea surface as well. So long as the water clarity is good, they get a reasonable depth. And I've seen here 8 or 9 meters, 25 feet of water, the laser's still working. And it gives us a sense of what the offshore is doing, but really in this study, we're focusing on the onshore. And so you can see the level of detail here when you look at Napatry. So that would be the crest of the big dunes right in there. This is the southern Bryan. Again, if you call it a jetty, it's really a Bryan. There's a northern one. There's a Musqueamicut Club and the Cabanas. And then you can see all of Napatry going out, including the lagoon and the point at the far west end. From that data, we can take slices and look at how it changed pre and post sanding. So this is one of our transects. I think there were 50 or 60 on Napatry that we measured. This is down near the west end, in front of the lagoon, near one of my current field survey sites. And you can see the before and after of Napatry. Red is erosion, green is deposition. So in this case, most of the dune was eroded away. Some of it ended up on the backside. So you see deposition behind the barrier. And actually 2 weeks after the storm, you see deposition on the beach, what we call the berm, which is essentially the towel space of the beach. So that tells us that within that 2 weeks, the beach had recovered. The dune system clearly had not. On the east end of the barrier, where the dunes are taller, it's much more what we call a collisional response. The surge did not overtop the barrier except at the paths across the backside, and they've done a lot of work to try to kind of reduce the number of crossovers. And you see dune erosion, but you don't see a lot of overwash. You see actually a little bit coming in from the base side on this transect. So we can look at those changes pre and post sanding and quantify how much sand moved around, how much the dunes lowered, or how much the dune crest moved backwards or forwards. All backwards, none of it were forward. We can also take those surfaces and subtract one from the other. And so where you see red, it's erosion, where you see green, it's deposition. And that allows us to, again, look at the whole of Napatry. Rather than just slices, we can look at the whole thing. From that data, we can also go along, say we again, a lot of this is me sitting in my basement during COVID. I can click along and map the elevation and location of the dune crest. And that's what this figure shows. That's the dune crest, and that should be 2011, yep. Along Napatry, from the west end to the east end. So essentially from the edge of the pine trees all the way down to the east end of Napatry to the big dune. I did it in front of the cabanas. The dune's under the cabanas, so it's kind of hard to map them from airborne LiDAR. That's what the dune crest looked like in 2012. And you can see kind of a line in the middle where to the right at the east end, there's not a lot of change. Again, the dunes eroded in the front, but they didn't lower all that much. The west end, where the dunes were lower, we see lots of overwash. Overwash isn't really a negative thing. It's just what barriers do during storms. And in some places, that one little line that dipped below that blue line, that part was probably underwater during the peak of sanding. The cool thing we can do with LiDAR, though, is then look at 2014 and 2018 and look at how Napatry has recovered since sanding. So it's not just here's all the doom and gloom, here's how the barrier came back. What happened to the dunes, what's happened to the volume of sediment on Napatry as well. We supplement that with field surveys. These are what we measure again 5 or 6 times a year. And this is an animated image that'll take you through our data set over about 7 years of time, from July of 2013 when we first set these up. And I think it was the hottest field day I've ever worked. up through June of 2020. And what you'll really notice as the time goes on is the beach is doing its thing, it's coming and going, but the dune, particularly in front of the existing dune crest and a little bit in the back, are going up and up and up over time. And it really shoots up between 2017 and 2020, and it continues today to follow that same trend. I just haven't updated that figure. The reason that it took a few years to get going is that's the vegetation in front of the eroded dune coming back. Right? Ammophila takes some time. Ammophila is American beach grass. It takes time for it to come back. Once it does, it helps to trap some of the sediment and help rebuild some of the dune. It doesn't have to be Ammophila. Some of the dunes start as clumps of seaweed get buried by sand. Those field surveys provide us information on that recovery process, and I'll come back to that in a second. But I want to go back to LiDAR one more time. One of the things LiDAR lets us do, besides look at those slices, is quantify or measure how much sand is on Napatry. And this shows Napatry in I'm losing track of my years, 2006 and 2011. The 2006 LiDAR, I have some reservations about the numbers on it, but it works for at least a rough scale on where we're at. 2011 LiDAR was pretty good. Technology improved a lot in those 5 years. If I bring up Sandy, again, 2 weeks after the storm, the overall volume of sand on Napatry really didn't change. Within the error bars of the 2 data sets, that means that we can't tell them apart. I can say they're different values, but I statistically can't say that. And then if I look at 2014 and 2018, I see an increase in the volume of Napatry. Again, not a huge change, but an increase. Where it got more interesting is we looked at it by elevation. I think I'm going to come back to that slide, I hope. Bear with me. If I don't come back, I'll just make myself go back to that. One of the questions then was, how is this recovery looking? And in the fall of 2019, I had a sabbatical, which means I don't have to teach for a semester. And it basically meant I could get caught up on some research, fish a little bit, surf a lot of mornings, but I could do stuff that didn't involve me going to the office every day. And one of the things I could do is just say, hey, you know what, I'm going to go out in the field today. And this extratropical storm, nor'easter, passed kind of a weird track in October of 2019. We didn't see a lot of coastal impact, but it was a snapping northwest wind. And I went out and did a survey. First time I went out during the storm, couldn't stand up, probably needed ski goggles to see, retreated back to the barn, came back later that afternoon. And you can see the peak wind gusts there were exceeding 44 knots, and sustained winds were over 30 knots for quite a while. That's well above the actual volume needed to move sand. About 20 knots, you could really start to move a lot of sand. So we were able to then go back and measure, because I surveyed the week before and the day after, how much sand actually accumulated on Napatry in that one particular event. Because when you're out there, you have to sort of kind of look at, oh, the sand's kind of fluffy here. Is that new? It probably is newly deposited. And we're able to measure this little bit of change. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, 0.7 cubic meters per meter. But along that stretch of dune, where the wind was right to move the sand, that's almost a cubic yard for every 3.5 feet of beach. So this section of dune, this wide, got almost a cubic yard of sand added to it. The yard next to it would have had a similar volume of sand approaching. Where did that fit? It comes from the beach. It flows from the beach onto the dunes.
I mean, it's good, right?
Yeah, of course that's good. More sand in the dunes is a bad thing. Right? We can see a similar thing at somewhere else. So this allowed us to start to put a sense for what kind of events are bringing the sand back to the dunes. So this is a slide I was looking for before. When I look at the LiDAR data, one of the other things we could do is look at it by elevation. So that earlier graph said, hey, the volume of Napatry didn't change pre and post sand. So that's weird. Well, let's look at it if I only look above 2 meters of elevation, which is essentially kind of the lower edge of the dunes. And then above 3 meters, which is where the dunes are a little taller, 4 meters where the dunes are actually pretty tall. And what you really notice is a big change in that red. And that shows us that the dune erosion that occurred during Sandy, this big drop, between 2011 and 2012. Not much recovery by 2014. And in that 2 years, the vegetation really hadn't taken over. But then between 2014 and 2018, you see a big increase in the dune volume. And that's again, the sand coming from the beach, probably coming from offshore as well. It takes time to get to the beach and then get into the dunes in that period between 2014 and 2018. So let's try to circle this back to storms before we wrap up. And I want to do that by showing Ayla Fox, who did some videography work for the Coastal Institute, filming around Napatry, put together a great slide that animates the aerial photography from 1939 to now. So I want to click play on that, and then we'll talk about it. There. Sure, let me finish this slide, and then yes, we can talk about Sandy Point. So I want to back that up and do that one more time. Sorry, that's this up. There we go. Jocelyn, I'm driving me nuts right now. Just trying to click with me. What you really notice is starting in the 70s, you see the color of Napatry in these photographs change. They go from bare sand or very sparse vegetation because the barrier had been overwashed in 1938. In 1944, probably some winter storms in the early 1950s, certainly in 1954 and 1962. And it seems like based on Sandy, which takes about, we figured 5 or 6 years to get kind of back in terms of the volume of sand. The dune heights are not what they were everywhere, but the volume of sand on Napatry is at least exceeding what it was before Sandy. But that period of time seems to be about 10 years. When you look at other places like Dauphin Island, like the Outer Banks of North Carolina, you need a 10-year window for a big storm like 38 to really allow the system to recover. And when that happens, and it did happen between the late 60s and the early 70s, enough dunes had built up on Napatry that it kept storms from overwashing it. Even Sandy, which overwashed it in part, was not nearly as devastating as it might have been if the dunes had been lower because of an earlier storm. So it really allows us to kind of close the loop and look at the impact of the storms, but also how the recovery time fits into that. Our monitoring continues. I thought I'd just share this one with you. That's an image from a time-lapse camera we have out on the Osprey pole. It takes a picture, we just send it out every 30 minutes, it's every hour. That was the wave run up during Larry, Friday at high tide. And you can actually see the wave, this is the high tide line from the peak wave. The biggest wave run up went right to about there. And you can see that dark and light line. That's what we actually look for in the aerial photographs as well. So let's put a bow on it and see if we can conclude some stuff up here. What can we conclude? One, storms drive shoreline change. That doesn't discount the multitude of other impacts sea level rise has, right? Don't hear that headline and think it's full of whatever talking about sea level rise. It just in terms of the actual changes to Napatry, storms drive the bus. Sea level rise inflates the tires on the bus a little higher every year, but storms drive. Sea level rise will likely accelerate any of this in the future. I'm not going to even argue about whether we'll see more or stronger storms. The science is actually a little bit challenging on that. It's intuitive to say warmer water, more hurricane, but as Dave Valley correctly said a couple weeks ago, it also increases things like wind shear, which means some storms may get blown apart and maybe just a slight increase in the actual number of storms. A big takeaway from our work with the shoreline change data is multiple storms inside of that recovery period has a big cumulative impact on the shoreline. And that's not completely new data, right? People have known that for a long time. Clifford Hayes published that in the 60s. But it really puts some numbers to it. A storm like the 44 hurricane probably wouldn't have had big impacts on Napatry if the 38 hurricane hadn't happened 6 years before. And recovery from Sandy took at least 5 years. We're still recovering in some parts, but at least 5 years. 38 hurricane scale event, it's going to be more than a decade to get everything back. And that's where that recovery time frame really starts to matter. And then finally, the timing of the storms inside of that recovery really does make a difference. And I think with that, I will leave it with one of Ayla's other pictures. I'll circle back to some of the point in a second for these questions. I'll go back to my slides right now. But I think that now we'll take any questions.